Lovely.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts of the US, because Jo Willett is coming to us from the UK, what we call across the pond. I'm not really sure if you guys call it the same.
We
But,
do, we do.
oh, you do? Okay, good. So,
Yes, we say the UK.
great. I'm not completely out of sync with the world. But before we get started, I just want to say a couple things. One is I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. They're amazing. And I would also like to let you know that you can buy signed books from Jo from Aesop's Fable. I will put a link for that in the chat. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen. I will be disabling the chat during Jo's presentation so that there's no distractions. And I'll turn it back on after her presentation during the Q&A, just so you guys can all chat with each other, which is always fun. So without sort of further ado, I'm going to say that I was thrilled when Jo said that she would do this talk, because her book called Sarah Siddons as First Celebrity Actress just sounds fascinating to me, because, well, you'll see from Jo's presentation about the book that Sarah Siddons was quite an interesting character. But Jo herself was a television drama producer for many years, and she has won all kinds of cool awards. But this is her second book, and I'm sure we'll get into her first book a little bit. But I am so excited for you, Jo, to be here and to talk about Sarah Siddons with us today. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Mina. Thank you for welcoming me. It's lovely to be here. It's a real honor. Excellent. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, aren't I? And then we'll have 20 minutes of questions.
Awesome.
Yes. Shall I go ahead and share my screen
Yes,
now?
please do.
Lovely. Here we go. Oh, there we go. Right. So here is Sarah Siddons, painted with the emblems of tragedy by Sir William Beechey. Sarah was the foremost tragic actress of her time. She was born in 1755 in the reign of George II and lived until 1831 in the reign of William IV. So she lived through in her life the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars between England and France, the Regency when George III was unwell and George IV took over. This painting dates from 1793, when Sarah was in her prime, aged 38. What were her early years? Well, she was born in 1755, the child of travelling players. Her parents, Roger and Sally Kemble, were part of Sally Kemble's parents' travelling troupe of players. And how it would work was these travelling players would go from town to town, often on foot. They would come into the town to try and raise awareness, and then they would put plays on. And they would probably stay in the town for several months, trying to put on plays and raise money that way. So Sally Kemble gave birth to her first child, the future Sarah Siddons, in the first floor of the Shoulder of Mutton pub in Brecon. The rest of the troupe had gone on to perform in Llandudrod Wells, so she gave birth alone and had the baby hurriedly baptised in her own name. And in fact, they got the father's name wrong. After the Restoration, so after 1660, so before Sarah was born, there was a desire, when Charles II became king and the English Civil War had come to an end, to censor what plays were performed in Britain, to control the message, if you like. And in 1713, under George II, a law was passed which classed actors as common players of interludes, along with vagabonds, mountebanks, and even performing animals. And in 1737, that law was strengthened even more, so that the contents of plays had to be pre-approved by the Lord Chamberlain, but also, most importantly, travelling players couldn't perform for money. So Sarah's parents had to pretend that they were putting on a concert and then do the play in the interval, or sell tooth powder and then give a little voucher so people could then come and see the play. So her family were living outside the law. It was an itinerant life. They never had a family home, and they had to find their venues wherever they went, and they lived hand to mouth. Sarah was the eldest of 12 children, and all of the children who survived went on to work in the theatre. Her brother, Stephen, describes lying as a child for 2 days in bed, hungry, with nothing to eat, until he eventually decided to go to a field and dig up a turnip. So this very tough early life affected Sarah in her later life. And this engraving is by William Hogarth, who was himself against the censorship. So here you see he has the actress dressed as classical deity, but are surrounded by a raucous, rowdy audience in a barn, which is often where plays were put on. The Kemples were unusual, Sarah's parents, in that they were married, and they were therefore quite respectable. Most traveling players were not married. And this was another theme of Sarah's life. All her life, she clung to respectability. And she was living at a time when actresses, even when she did very well, her actresses who were her contemporaries were often former sex workers or the mistresses of wealthy men. They didn't have to support a family like she did. So Sarah met her future husband, William Siddons, when she was 11 and he was 23, when he came as an actor to join the company, her parents' company. This is the only portrait we have of him. And the Reverend Henry Bate said of him, he was a damn rascally player, but a civil fellow. Even as an older man, you can see that he was pretty handsome. And William and Sarah played opposite each other. And even though there was this 12 years difference between them, pretty quickly an intimacy developed. Biographers tend to gloss over how quickly that intimacy developed, and also about the age gap, which today would be a cause of concern for us. But you can see how intimacy happened, and obviously they were playing opposite each other as romantic leads. Her parents were not at all enthusiastic about the relationship, but by 1773, she was 18. They still needed her parents' consent to marry, but they had decided to agree to it. And so the Siddons were married in November 1773 in Coventry. Sarah was only 18, and the marriage lasted for over 30 years, and they always referred to each other fondly as Sal and Sid. Soon, Sal and Sid left her parents' company and went to join another company in Cheltenham, and their first son, Henry, was born. On the left here, you see David Garrick. Now, Garrick was the foremost actor and theatre manager of his time, and he was in charge of the Drury Lane Theatre, which you see on the right. That's how it would have looked like, what it looked like in Sarah's time when she first came to London. Garrick was an enormous force of energy and transformed British theatre, but he always needed new talent. So he sent out 2 different scouts because he'd heard news that there was a young, talented actress in the Shires. And the Reverend Henry Bate, who was one of the scouts, wrote back to him that he'd met Sarah and that she was remarkably pleasing and characteristic. He had concerns about her voice, but he did list 23 leading roles that she could perform in. She was, he said, a remarkably quick study, which was necessary because they were acting in rep, so they had to be pretty fast learners. But she was pregnant by the time Henry Bate came to see her with their second child. But regardless of that, she was recruited to come to work at Drury Lane. And so she arrived in London in 1775 to join Garrick's very famous company for his final season because he was retiring. In November of 1775, she had given birth to her second child, Sally. And so she delayed joining the company until the baby was born. And then she set off for London. And only a month after Sally had been born, she appeared for the first time on the London stage. Now, she'd probably almost certainly never been to London before. She'd never met Garrick himself. She was cast immediately as Portia in The Merchant of Venice. And she came on stage and had the most terrible case of stage fright. She was wearing the most terrible, unflattering salmon pink outfit lent to her by Drury Lane, and her voice completely failed her. She spoke in an inaudible whisper, and it was a disaster. Writing about it many years later, she wrote, "The awful consciousness that one is the sole object of attention to that immense space," in other words, Drury Lane, lined as it were with human intellect from top to bottom and on all sides round, may perhaps be imagined, but cannot be described, and never, never to be forgotten. But as I say, it was a disaster. The press next day was terrible, and the Middlesex Journal wrote, "There is not room to expect anything beyond mediocrity." How it worked was that the Siddons were employed for the winter season at Drury Lane. So it would normally be from September to March. Obviously, she hadn't joined to December because of the pregnancy. And then in the spring and summer, actors were free to either take it easy or to go to the provinces and earn money there. And obviously, Sarah needed to keep earning money. So the end of the season came. It hadn't got any better since the Portia debacle, and she'd been cast in fewer and fewer roles. But she left, and the Siddons went to Birmingham, where even the critics there said she motions loudly, but she can't shout out loud. Garrick, as I said, it'd been his final season, so there was a new set of managers at Drury Lane, and they didn't even bother to write to the Siddons themselves. The Prompt wrote a letter to the Siddons, which they received in Birmingham, said that their contracts were not to be renewed. Well, Sarah fell into a deep, deep depression of despair. How was she going to manage? William wasn't a particularly good actor. The pressure was on her to keep earning. And so the two of them continued performing in the provinces, in Manchester, in Liverpool, and in York, where the very kindly manager Tate Wilkinson took Sarah under his wing. And he it was who first began to cast her in tragedies. She had thought she was a comic actress, but he could see she was much, much better at tragedies. Then she was recruited by John Palmer, who ran the old Orchard Street Theatre in Bath, which after the London theatres was the most prestigious theatre in the UK at the time. And Sarah came to perform there, and immediately it was a success. In the middle here, you've got Royal Crescent in Bath, painted or engraving at the time that Sarah was living there. And the Siddons lived in Bath for 4 years. I think probably the happiest time of their marriage. And William gave up acting because he wasn't a very good actor and became Sarah's manager. And she soon was the darling of much of Bath society, because all society came to Bath to drink the water. So on the left here, you have the very famous Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, who became a patroness of Sarah's. On Thursday evenings, the great and the good of Bath tended to go to what's known as the cotillion balls to dance, but Palmer had the brilliant idea of casting Sarah every week in a different tragedy, and very soon all of Bath was coming to that instead. So as I say, they lived there for 4 years, but inevitably she was recruited again, this time by the new management, by Richard Brinsley Sheridan, who was part of the new management, the playwright, and his father, Thomas Sheridan, recruited her to come back to London. And she was wary of that. She knew she had to be careful. And so here we have the first instance of Sarah curating her own image, being very, very careful how she told her public in Bath that she was going to leave them and come and work in London. The image she liked to portray of herself always was of a very happily married woman and a loving mother. She'd by then given birth to her third child, Maria, and so she arranged an evening where she came onto the stage with her 3 oldest children, holding Henry, her son, and Sally, her eldest daughter, and then cradling Maria in her arms. And she gave a poem called The 3 Reasons Speech, where she gave her 3 reasons for leaving Bath to go to London. In other words, her 3 reasons were her children, and was because she was doing it because she wanted the best for her children. And I put up this picture here of the Princess of Wales with her children, which you may remember was a portrait or a picture that was taken just before the Princess of Wales admitted that she had cancer. And there was a lot of controversy over it because it was said to have been doctored. And I think there's a very clear parallel here. These were 2 women, both of whom understand the importance of the value of portraying yourself as a loving wife and mother. As someone at the time said of Sarah, one would as soon make love to Mrs. Siddons as to the Archbishop of Canterbury. But Sarah did return to London, and on the 10th of October, 1782, aged 27, now the mother of 4, She played the part of Isabella in Thomas Southern's play, Isabella or the Fatal Marriage. You see her on the left here doing that, a play which had been written at the end of the 17th century. And her first night there was said to be one of the most triumphant ever on the London stage. Her son, Henry, played her son in the play. And Richard Brinsley Sheridan, who you see on the right, who was the manager and very clever in terms of press management, he heard the story that during rehearsal, Sarah's son Henry had burst into tears. He was so upset by the plot. He didn't realize it was only a plot. And Sheridan leaked that to the press because he could see that it would be very, very helpful to get the audience in. Sheridan, by the way, was a very talented playwright. You may well know The School for Scandal and The Rivals, his very good, funny plays. And he was owner-manager of Drury Lane, but actually by now he was not interested in the theatre. His ambitions were political, and he was a terrible, terrible payer. So even though Sarah worked for him for many years, he was very bad at paying her. But anyway, her first night as Isabella, as James Bowden, her biographer, wrote, she seemed to electrify the audience. In the final act, she gave a laugh of peculiar wildness, and as Bowden said, she'd come to London to found a new religion. She returned home to the rented rooms in the Strand, which she and William Siddons were renting, and her father was there as well, and they had a simple supper together. They could not believe the success she'd had, and it was only broken by the sound of Roger Kemble, Sarah's father's, tears dropping onto the plate. So thrilled was he. So Sarah then went on to play a series of tragic roles. And there was something we talk about, which is the Siddonian heroine. In other words, the heroines that Sarah tended to play. So on the left here, on the right here, she's playing Belvidera in Thomas Otway's play, Venice Preserved. And on the left, she's playing Euphrasia in Arthur Murphy's play, The Grecian Daughter. It's difficult for us because we don't know these plays, and to us they would seem melodramas. But Sarah's audience loved her. All the characters she played in all these plays had a heroic sense of duty. They were terribly principled. They were often noble, often royal. They were always very brave. If they were romantically involved, it nearly always led to unhappiness. And the plays had extraordinary twists of fate, with very often Sarah's character committing suicide in the final act. And her audience connected totally to it. They had what was called Siddons fever. They would cry out, they would even faint, they would scream at what was going on in front of them. They had total connection to Sarah. And what they connected to really was the emotion. We're going now from the age of reason of the 18th century to the Romantic age, and Sarah was performing at just the right time. Bowden said of her that she seemed to tower beyond her sex. She was very tall, very slim, and her voice, which had been a problem for Garrick, now with a very particular delivery, was seen as one of her strengths. She also was someone who studied very hard for her roles and always inhabited them completely. Sarah's most famous role was that of Lady Macbeth in Shakespeare's play Macbeth. And the diarist Hazlitt, William Hazlitt, who saw her perform, said she was tragedy personified as Lady Macbeth. She first played the role of Lady Macbeth on the 2nd of February, 1785, at Drury Lane. In those days, actresses tended to almost own a role. If you were in London and you played a role very well, then other actresses didn't get to play it. But Hannah Pritchard, the actress of a previous generation, was now at a stage where she was retiring. And so Sarah inherited the role from her. But Sarah changed things from the way that Hannah Pritchard had done them. So during the famous sleepwalking scene, which is the final scene where Lady Macbeth appears, and you see Sarah on the left playing that role, Sarah changed what Hannah Pritchard done. Hannah had held the candle throughout, but Sarah comes in, puts the candlestick down and tries to wash out the damp spot, wash out the blood of the murdered victim's blood from her nightdress. She also wore a very different costume from normal. Hannah Pritchard wore a very smart black evening gown, like a ball gown. But Sarah didn't wear a formal gown. She came on in clouds of white drapery, as if encased in a shroud. And the first night where she was there was a very illustrious audience. Edmund Burke was there, Charles James Fox, Edward Gibbon, and the portrait painter Joshua Reynolds. In fact, Reynolds himself had designed her costume. In order to research the part, Sarah had visited a lunatic asylum, and we still have her notes on how she understood the part of Lady Macbeth, where she stresses Lady Macbeth's femininity and seductive power. She sees Lady Macbeth as just as culpable as Macbeth. And she points out that Macbeth was very, very in love with his wife. And she says that Macbeth often talks about his love for Lady Macbeth, but Lady Macbeth never reciprocates in that way. So just before Sarah was about to go on stage on the first night, Sheridan came into her dressing room and said, I don't think you're right. I don't think you can change from what Hannah Pritchard does. But she said to him, look, I've rehearsed it this way. I can't change it now. I've got to do it. And so she went on and did it. It was a huge success. And Sheridan came backstage afterwards to apologize and congratulate her on the fact that she had put down that candlestick and washed out her hands. So you would have thought that Sarah, as this hugely successful actress, a superstar, more highly paid than any performer of her era, would have been very safe from attack. But she was living in a very dangerous world. She was mobbed wherever she went. There were always crowds coming to see her. But I think more dangerous than that physically were attacks from the press. At the time, there was a very, very vicious free press which had emerged, much more powerful than the past. And that was for various reasons. Partly, religion wasn't as important as it had been. The monarchy, which seemed to be very important, had become less important. Now we have the Georgians. And Parliament had become more powerful, but it was very clearly very corrupt. At the same time, there were steam printing presses, which meant that it was much easier for newspapers to be printed, much cheaper. And there was a new stagecoach system, which meant that they could be disseminated throughout Britain. There were also very weak libel laws, so it wasn't possible if someone libeled you, you couldn't really defend yourself. It was very, very difficult. And there was also an increase in leisure time, so people had more time to think about this kind of thing. So on the left here, we have a cartoon by the famous cartoonist James Gilray, which portrays Sarah as Lady Sarah Save-All, really arguing that she was very money-grabbing. So she's seen as the muse of tragedy. She's often called the muse of tragedy, Melpomene, and she's reaching up to heavens. But what she's actually trying to do is to release funds from the devil's pitchfork. And the money bags look like testicles. So she seems to be what he's attacking her, both for her avarice, for her wish for money, and also she's sexualized in a way she absolutely never wanted to be. And in the middle here, we have another cartoon by Nathaniel Lee in 1782, where Sarah is portrayed on the left, bare-breasted, fighting with a rival actress in the company, Mary Ann Yates. So again, she's been sexualized. And again, to make the parallel, on the right here, I have a famous case in Britain, which you may not know about in the US. It's known as the Wagatha Christie case, and it's two footballers' wives, Rebecca Hardy and Colleen Rooney, the press were thrilled that they fell out very badly, and they used that. And it's a very similar thing to the press being rather excited about the fact that clearly Sarah Siddons and Mary Ann Yates weren't getting on that well. Sarah, though, was very, very clever in terms of using her celebrity to protect herself and to build a wall around herself so that she wasn't as prey. I mean, she was prey to the hostility of the press, but not as much as she might have been. Now, when I say she was a celebrity, why is that different from saying she was famous? The definition of a celebrity as opposed to someone who's famous is somebody who is very, very reliant always on their fan base. It doesn't matter if you're famous, but if a celebrity, you need your fans. It's also a kind of transient fame. It's vulnerable. She could go at any moment. She's very prey to the judgment of her fans, and she's always scared of losing power. And the twin attacks that a celebrity is always prey to are sex and money. Hence the Gilray cartoon, sex and money. So one of the things that Sarah did in terms of how she dealt with this was she made sure that she was painted by all the great portrait artists of the time. And then those portraits were made. They were exhibited at the Royal Academy, which is very close to Drury Lane and Covent Garden, where later Sarah went. And then they were sold, but also engravings were made of those portraits so that they could then be disseminated throughout Britain, so that all Sarah's fans, if they wanted, could own a picture of her likeness. Here on the left is a very famous portrait of her by Thomas Gainsborough, which is at the National Gallery in London, painted in 1785 before she played Lady Macbeth, but where she was already a huge star. And what's very interesting with this, by the way, Gainsborough painted her, but he did say, is there no end to this nose? He found her quite difficult to paint. But you see that she is dressed not as an actress, but as a society lady. So you might think she's a duchess, rather like Georgiana we saw earlier, but she's not. She's an actress from very, very poor background. And her hair is powdered. Now, by this time, Sarah had given up having powdered hair on stage. The fashion was now to have your own hair color. But in terms of respect, Gainsborough paints her with powdered hair. And then in the bottom right, you see a medallion. They were made by Wedgwood, the famous ceramicist. And again, lots of copies were made of these and fans could buy them. Her fans could also read about her, obviously, in the paper, but also she appeared in fiction and people could put on the plays that they knew Sarah Siddons had performed in. Their friends who had seen her acting could tell their friends how to play the role in a Siddonian-like way. Another of her biographers, Thomas Campbell, described how he was in Pall Mall and he saw a lot of carriages lined up in Pall Mall. And he thought they were coming to see the royal family, but they weren't. They were coming to see Sarah. And she was very, very used to have strangers just knock on her door at any time and demand to come into her living room and stare at her. In the top right-hand corner, we have King George and Queen Charlotte, who was king for most of the time that Sarah was successful. And they were big fans of Sarah Siddons. They really liked her. And of course, for them, marriage was also important, and they had many children. So there was a huge connection between the two. George even employed Sarah to read to their children so that they could educate their children. Perhaps the most famous portrait of Sarah is the Tragic Muse, painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds, which is here. Now, you can see that at the Huntington Library in California, or there is a copy of it made actually also by Reynolds himself, which is at the Dulwich Picture Library here in London. Reynolds painted this in May 1783, so before Lady Macbeth, and he chooses to paint Sarah not as a society lady, but as a mythical figure, as the muse of tragedy, Melpomene. When she came to be painted by him, he was 60 years old already. She was in her early 30s. She came to Leicester Fields, where his studio was. He'd had many visitors who'd walk around the whole time during the portrait sessions. She'd normally have to sit from about 15 sessions for each portrait. And she always made sure, Sarah, to give that time to her portrait painters. So even though she had a very busy life, as she said, she was an ambitious candidate for fame when it came to having her painting done. Reynolds was apparently very anxious when he painted this. People describe him with his wig askew and his stockings loose, painting frantically. Having a Joshua Reynolds paint your portrait was a very theatrical experience, and he always kept a mirror close to his subjects' faces so they could see how it was going. And the whole feeling was very spontaneous, not unlike a theatrical performance. Sarah describes how she came into the room and there was a raised seat at the end, and she went to it and she slumped down in exactly this position. And so she said that she accredited herself with this position. There are actually some people who think that perhaps isn't quite the case. Mary Ann Yates, who we've seen her fighting with bare-breasted, at the time was playing the role of Jane Shore in Covent Garden, when Sarah was playing it in Drury Lane. And she had been painted like that in the same position a few years earlier. And so maybe Reynolds was copying that. But it's a very striking pose. And as he went along and painted the portrait, Reynolds did begin to change it. You can see just about on the right, we've got the figures of pity and fear, and he got rid of a cherub. He thought that was wrong. Originally, he had a figure of melancholy on the left, but he changed that to, instead of melancholy, it became horror. And because he was short of time, probably, he painted himself as horror. So he's in the portrait as well. She was originally wearing a very cream dress, but he changed it to a much more dramatic gold with fur. And according to Sarah, he wanted to darken her skin tone, but she argued to keep her skin pale. At the end, he wrote his name on her hem and said, I have resolved to go down for posterity on the hem of your garment. And you can see absolutely why Sarah wanted to tell the world all about this. It portrays her very well. And of course, it's a very famous painting. And she went on in a way later in life to become a sort of national treasure. She also played the part of Britannia. So she seemed almost to embody Britain in the Napoleonic Wars. But Sarah, so we said she was married, she had a vicious press. What was there that she needed to hide from the press? And what did she manage to hide from the press? Well, everyone has skeletons in their cupboard. And one of these is to do with a love triangle that Sarah had going on. In the bottom here, you see Sir Thomas Lawrence, painted by Richard Evans. Reynolds was the first president of the Royal Academy. Lawrence became the second. And he was about 12 years younger than Sarah. And the two of them were friends all his adult life. She'd first met him when he was just a schoolboy, when his parents kept the Black Bear Inn at Devizes, and he used to draw drawings of people who came in for money. Then the family fortunes changed, and he came as a teenager to Bath, and there, of course, the Siddons were there, and so he got to know the family and got to know Sarah's children. And then when the Siddons came to London, he followed them to London, and he had a studio there, and as I say, became president of the Royal Society. Now, on the left here, we have Sarah's eldest daughter, Sally Siddons, painted or drawn by Thomas Lawrence. And in the 1790s, Lawrence, who was 12 years older or so than Sally, so midway between Sarah Siddons and her oldest daughter, Sally, began to have feelings for Sally. And although they didn't have a formal engagement, it was evident that they planned to spend the rest of their lives together. But Sally didn't have the best of health. She had terrible asthma, and she began to sicken, and the family tried to keep that from Thomas Lawrence. But he then found himself spending time with, on the right, Maria Siddons, Sarah Siddons' second daughter. And Lawrence and Maria started a clandestine relationship. And obviously that was very difficult for Sally, but she tried to be brave about it. Maria was William Siddons' favourite daughter. And so she asked her father if she could become engaged to Thomas Lawrence, and the two became engaged. But then Maria herself sickened. She got TB, very common at the time. Again, the family tried to keep this from Lawrence, but he found himself spending more time with Sally, and he then realized he'd made a mistake and that actually Sally was the person that he had feelings for. Maria was taken to Clifton in the West Country because she was sickening with TB. I mean, it was an incurable disease at the time. Sarah herself was on tour because she needed to earn money to keep the family going, but she rushed back to Maria's bedside in late September to be at her daughter's bedside for her death. And just before her death, Maria extracted a promise from her older sister Sally that she would never marry Sir Thomas Lawrence. So then after Maria's death, I mean, Sally obviously still had feelings for Lawrence, but also Sarah herself had a very, very close relationship with Lawrence. He painted her portrait many, many times, and he was a valuable help to her in deciding what to wear and what her performances were like. But Lawrence was a difficult figure. He was a brooding presence. Almost you feel the way that he was with these two Siddons daughters. It was almost like he was a kind of vampire sucking the life out of them. He wrote a very famous letter about Sally. He said, "I have played deeply for her, and you think she will escape me. I'll tell you a secret. It is possible she may. Mark the end." But to Sally's chagrin, her mother, Sarah, continued to see Lawrence. He painted portraits of her. He went to see her on stage. And therefore, there was the mother and daughter became estranged. It wasn't the close relationship it had been. In May 1802, Sarah was on tour in Ireland. Went on tour in Ireland. Again, she needed the money for the family. And she was aware that Sally's health wasn't so good. She wrote back to William, her husband, saying, "I'm concerned." And William wrote to her in March 1803 saying, no, she's fine. Press on, go on to Cork. We need the money. But of course, Sally sickened. Sarah couldn't get back from Ireland. She eventually managed to cross the Irish Sea. She got to Shrewsbury, and there was a letter waiting for her there to tell her that her oldest daughter, Sally, had died, and she hadn't been at her daughter's bedside. Again, shameful if you're supposed to be this wonderful mother. Here is Sarah on the left, what's always known as the toothache portrait, painted by Thomas Lawrence around the time of her daughter Sally's death. So Sally's death put a terrible strain on the Siddons' marriage, but there had been strains before. William, as I say, had become his wife's manager, but he was terrible. He wasn't a good manager. He often asked too much money for her, which estranged other people, hence the nickname of Lady Sarah Sable. He also invested quite badly in some of their money. He invested in Sadler's Wells and lost lots of money that way. In 1792, 10 years earlier, Sarah had discovered that her husband had a mistress, and William had given Sarah syphilis. The two were reconciled, and their youngest daughter, Cecilia, was born the following year. But again, rather like TB, syphilis was something that you weren't going to get rid of if you were living in the 18th century. It was with you, even if it didn't kill you immediately. Ultimately, you were never going to get rid of it. And Sarah's surgeon, Sir Lucas Pepys, suggested to her that she say that she had a skin disease called erysipelas when she began to feel unwell. But my own feeling is that this was really early stages of syphilis. But Sarah herself wasn't totally innocent in the marriage. She also had had an affair with her fencing master, Philemon Galindo. So in autumn 1804, the Siddons separated after 31 years of marriage. Sarah was very careful to keep that out of the press and did very well in doing it. By now, she was a national treasure, so it was easy for her to do so. And the Siddons separated after 31 years of marriage, and Sarah was able to buy this house on the right, Westbourne Farm, where she'd always dreamed of having a country cottage. She retired in 1812, age 56, and she continued to do benefits and readings the rest of her life. And in 1817, she bought a house in Upper Regent Street in London because the country cottage was difficult to manage with her young daughter. But in 1831, on the 8th of June, Sarah died, just short of 76 years old. And at her funeral, which was at St Mary's Green in Paddington, on the left here, 5,000 people lined the streets as her coffin went by, where she was buried at St Mary's, and 11 mourning coaches filled with actors from Covent Garden and Drury Lane came to see her perform. And on the right here, a statue still stands today, the statue of the Tragic Muse, in other words, taken from the Reynolds portrait, which was put up thanks to Henry Irving. And I think you can show that shows the success that Sarah had with brand control. Irving said of her, "The sunshine of her genius touched with gold the prose of common life, and the ablest men and women of her day knew and valued her work and worthiness." She would have been very pleased indeed with that as an epitaph for her life. Many thanks. I'll now stop sharing.
Wow. Thank you. I sort of feel like you could have been talking about the Kardashians. Like,
Good, good. I
yeah,
hope that wasn't too fast a canter through her life. It's a lot to take in.
no, not at all. That was great. I want to remind people that if you have questions for Jo, to put them in the Q&A, and I will ask her your questions for the next few minutes. And so
No.
I'm going to get started with, um, we always hear that actors back in that day, or actresses, were considered the like mistresses of like the rich people. They acted and then they were mistresses. Was there, I know she had her own things where she was cheating, he was cheating, all of that stuff. But did they ever, was that how she was portrayed, or was she like portrayed differently than that?
No, she was absolutely portrayed as this happily married, virtuous wife. And perhaps I didn't read and mother. And that is why, because she played all these heroines, all of whom were terribly virtuous. So it was very, very important to her that she was seen as that. And that's why those skeletons in her cupboard, she had to keep them locked away because she did not want the world to know about that. Because if that went, then probably her whole career would have come tumbling down.
Mm-hmm.
And very, very unusual at the time, because as you say, most actresses were had certainly had been sex workers, and nearly all of them were mistresses. It was very unusual. She was the sole earner in the household. And again, that was very, very unusual. She wasn't independently wealthy. She had to keep earning.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I think she feels a very modern story, really.
Yeah, yeah. Because because the press was just as vicious, not vicious, relentless back then as they are now. Maybe you
Yes.
don't have social media, but like to be able to hide so much from the press just seems very amazing to me.
I know she was very, very adept at it. Partly, I think it was because of the royal patronage and because people liked to think of her as this national treasure. That's why I love that quote about one would as soon make love to Sarah Siddons as the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Mhm.
That's how people liked to think of her.
Mhm.
Um, and I would think that if we met her today, she would say she was virtuous. I mean, even with Willem and Galindo, the fencing master, I don't know whether actually anything really happened there, but clearly there was quite a lot that happened there.
Mhm.
And Galindo's wife wrote a whole pamphlet accusing Sarah of some terrible things, which past biographers have tended to say, oh, that doesn't matter. Actually, when you look at it, a lot of what Catherine Galindo said very clearly went on.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, like, unfortunately, a lot of the, where there's smoke, there's fire kind of thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which,
So,
of course, we are so aware of today. We're very heightened as they were in the 18th century with all this gossip and innuendo. And yes,
mm,
social media has made that so much worse.
yes, yeah, absolutely. So I have a bunch of questions from our audience, which is awesome.
Good.
JA says, great presentation, but I'm still trying to understand who taught Sarah the craft of acting.
Ah, yes, I'm sorry, because there's so much to get through. Well, her parents taught her the craft. I mean, she learned at her parents' knees. I mean, she couldn't remember when she first started acting. It was very much a family business, and everybody went on and they all played parts. So she didn't think weren't such things as formal acting schools, but she learned with her father. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was very difficult to go to London so young and into a very prestigious place. And it was just too much for her, age 20.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. But she was largely, by the way, I mean, not formally educated. I mean, her mother, I think her mother was a very strong character and must have taught her to read and write, but she hardly ever went to school. So she was, she learned it all through her parents.
Mhm. It's interesting that parents taught her acting, or that was a family business, because again, at the time it wasn't a reputable profession.
No, well, that's what I was trying to say. They were in the same class as vagabonds, or yes, and animals. Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. Yes.
They,
But because the Kembles were married, they saw it as a respectable thing.
mhm.
And actually, her maternal grandfather had done quite a lot to kind of to preserve Shakespeare in Stratford and make Shakespeare people to realize how important Shakespeare was. So there was that very strong strand in the family of scholarship about the theatre,
Wow,
about plays. Mm.
fascinating. So just to sort of stay on that topic of her
Yes.
parents, somebody asked, did Sarah maintain her relationships with her parents and her siblings?
Oh, very much so. Yes, yes, yes. I mean, yes, she was always very close to her parents, very close. Her mother even lived with her at a time when the father had died. But again, because I didn't have time really in the presentation to explain that her eldest brother, John Philip Kemble, was hugely successful along with Sarah. He was an actor manager, a bit like Garrick had been, and he ran Drury Lane, and they really performed alongside each other most of the time. And then when John Philip went to Covent Garden, Sarah went as well. And she did perform with her other siblings as well, both her brothers a lot, not quite so successfully with her sisters. Again, you have to read between the lines, but it feels as if it didn't quite work to be on stage alongside the amazing Sarah Siddons if you were her sister. And in fact, one of them came to America and was very successful in America for a time.
So maybe I missed this, but I know that you said that she became like more popular in her early 30s. But how long did it take her to just like start acting in public to at 20 to get to like what changed that made her super popular?
Well, I think she worked at it. She had to work in the provinces, and she began to hone her craft there. And as I say, she had thought she was a comic actress, but really she began to realize she was much, much better at tragedy. And then she went to York, where this guy, Tate Wilkinson, was very fatherly and very helpful to her. And then, of course, she then came to Bath, and Bath was like a mini London. So she was able to really hone her skills there, and they really showcased her as a tragic actress there. So by the time she came to London for the second time, she already was a success. Okay, she wasn't earning as much as she was going to go on to earn, but she was well known already. It was very different in 1782 from how it had been in 1775, when she was just a young 20-year-old coming to London for the first time, already with two children.
That must have been quite a turn for her, though, to go from like being super
Yes.
frightened
Yeah,
at 20 to being like this powerhouse of promotion.
absolutely. I know. No, and she was very, very, she had grown very skilled at it. She was clever. She was very adept at this kind of
I love
thing.
that because again, people will denigrate any like somebody like that for like by sexualizing them or infantilizing them or something like that. But yet she wasn't just somebody who could act.
No, not at all. Not at all. No, it was the complete package, really, which is why she was so clever. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't always great. She had terrible trouble in Ireland. Whenever she went to Ireland, it seemed to go badly wrong and the press laid into her. And she did have this reputation of being terribly mean. Yeah, which isn't a great reputation to have, but even so, she kept her fans, and she had many, many fans who were very devoted.
I do want to just comment on the thing about being mean. Is that a perception that people had, or is that something that people said about her because they didn't like that a woman was becoming so popular, or was become, like how women nowadays can be really words can be put towards us that don't really apply just because people are jealous or upset or whatever.
I know. I mean, I think the thing is that William, as her manager, demanded too high fees for her.
Yes.
And the trouble is, as often happens now in productions, TV productions actually, if the star gets all the money, the other actors really don't get paid very much at all. And it was really bad in the 18th century. And often the managers didn't get paid. So they were quite resentful towards her. And also, I think because of that very insecure childhood, it was terribly important to her that her family all had a very comfortable home and they were well looked after. So it wasn't that she wanted fur coats for herself. She actually wasn't particularly interested in that kind of stuff. But that's why she felt she needed to have money. Yeah, but I think obviously that then the press blew it up because there were stories about things like when she went to church, she held back so she didn't have to put so much money in the collection box. Well, I don't think that really happened personally. I think that was the press embroidering it. But of course, it was an image they could use for her.
Yeah. Ellen asked this really great question. Do you think that she was such a great tragic actress since she had a lot of tragedy in her real life?
I absolutely think that. Yes, I'm very, very good to have pointed that out. Absolutely. And I think weirdly, the one kind of mirrored the other because obviously the stuff with Lawrence was later on when she was already a very established actress, but I think she was so into it, she sort of almost, as can happen, I think, that it sort of played out in her own life. But certainly, yeah, that's, I think, why she was much, much better at that. She was supposed to have had a great sense of humor, but she could never convey that on stage.
Mm-hmm.
And there was Dora Jordan, was her contemporary, who was the queen of comedy, the muse of comedy. And she just came on stage and was immediately funny. But actually, she had a tragic life too, so that doesn't work. But Sarah, overall, it wasn't such a tragic life, but there were elements of tragedy that I think absolutely played into her life, definitely.
Well, I mean, to lose two of your three children, I think
I know.
it's going
Yes.
to be tragic. But
Yes.
we have a question here. In your biography of Sarah, which I very much look forward to reading, do you cover the situation with actor William Brereton, his obsession with her? Her cold-hearted treatment of him in Dublin and in London is believed to be partly responsible for his descent into madness.
Yes, I do cover that. Yes, I was saying that Ireland was a problem. Yes, yes. So Brereton, I think, definitely fell in or had a huge kind of passionate crush on her. And they went to Ireland together. And it's a rather complicated story, so I don't give it in my talk. But there was a system where actors had benefit nights where basically all the money went to them that night. And because of a series of mix-ups, Sarah didn't do a benefit night for William Brereton in the way that he had hoped. So that played into the idea that she was mean, and it also played into his kind of hatred of her. When she came back to London, the audience in Drury Lane mobbed her, they screamed at her, and she had to come on stage and argue her own case for it. Yes. And then another extraordinary twist, Brereton then went to an asylum and died. And his wife, Patty, then went on to marry Sarah Siddons' brother, John Philip Kemble, the brother who was the actor manager. So it's all very kind of incestuous and closely linked. Yeah. So I do cover that. But yes, so there are lots of things in the book I can't cover in the talk. So
I get you. We only have an hour, people. But I have two questions, or two people have asked the same question about what made you choose writing about Sarah? And an additional part of that question is she very well known in England? Because I had never heard of her. So this is really fascinating to me.
Oh, good. Yes. Well, I'm trying to sort of plow a furrow of looking at women who, particularly in the 18th century, who are not, I feel should be better known. So my first book was about a woman called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who again is someone who is extraordinary life, but is not very well known. And that went well. So I thought, well, I'm going to stay in the 18th century and I'm going to find somebody else like that. And because all my working life before I became a biographer, I was, as you said, a TV drama producer. So all my working life, I've worked with actors. I'm very interested in the craft of acting. So I thought it'd be good to find a performer. And as I started to read about Sarah, I realized the last full-length biography of Sarah was written in 1970, so a long, long time ago. And I thought there is a story here that needs to be told, because these past biographies don't really explore the whole way that she controlled her image, which feels so relevant for us today. So that's the answer to that, really. Yes. Yeah.
I have a question about art, because the artist that painted Sarah, even I have heard of. Like, I am not an art aficionado whatsoever. How did that happen where she became so popular that the best artists of the day were clamoring to paint her?
By the way, I can just see in the chat a tiny little moment saying someone, I'm from England, I'd heard of her. I think when you say Mrs. Siddons, some people in England have heard about her. Hang on, let me just decline that. Or turn that off. Well, I think the portrait painters, it suited them to paint the actresses of the time. It was a kind of symbiotic relationship between the theatre and portrait painters, particularly with the Royal Academy being so close. And of course, she was very striking looking. So, and also it was a very interesting thing to paint. They probably got slightly bored of painting aristocrats the whole time. So it was a way of portraying her. But I feel she should be much better known. I think her story should be better known. I mean, she's around, but only when you look at her. And I think academics have said, which I think is probably true, that her greatest legacy today is really the portraits, because a lot of people know those portraits, but they don't actually really know the story of Sarah Siddons' life, which is an interesting one, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Lucy says, All About Eve featured a fictional Sarah Siddons award. Was she
Yeah.
still a name among theater people in the 1950s when that film was made?
Was she still a name? Yeah, in Chicago, there is the Sarah Siddons Award. It's still given in theatre, and it's been given to lots of prestigious people. I suppose it must be to do with the fact that she was an actress, and yeah, it comes from that time. I must do some research into finding out how the Sarah Siddons Award is called the Sarah Siddons Award, because it's to do with a theatre in Chicago that it came from. Yeah.
I
Yes.
just want to
And
go,
the other thing is, lots of people say to me that Rufus Wainwright wrote a song about Sarah Siddons, or as a Sarah Siddons features in it. And actually, it's about the statue, which I show right at the end. It's about his being at that statue. So, which is a rather nice thing.
yeah. I love that you've taken somebody who is on and off well known and sort of gave her a real face. Again, going back to the art, I find it funny that who said that her nose would just go on and
Oh,
on.
Gainsborough, yes.
I was like, she's
There's no end to
gorgeous,
that nose.
and her nose are gorgeous. I mean, art is art, you know, you never know exactly how they look, but they obviously very beautiful people. Um, did Sarah ever visit America? She is known here, perhaps only in theatrical circles, but was well respected from what I've read.
Yes, no, she didn't travel very much actually. She went to France, and she was there just before Waterloo and met the Duke of Wellington.
Mhm.
And apparently they met at a party and they were both so tongue-tied, neither of them could think of anything to say to each other, which was fantastic. And John Philip Kemble, her brother, he retired to Switzerland when he finished performing. So she went to see her brother in Switzerland. And of course she went to Ireland, if that counts. Obviously at that time it was all part of Great Britain, but she never went anywhere else. But as I say, her sister Elizabeth Kemble did come to, I think because she was escaping from Sarah Siddons' success, came to America and was successful as a Shakespeare actress. And she had a very difficult relationship with this quite tricky sister, who again, I had time to talk about in the book, but really I don't talk. And his sister was disabled, Anne Kemble, and she went to America and wrote an opera, or the book for an opera that was on in New York. And of course, also probably in America, you will know about Fanny Kemble, who was Sarah's niece. And she was an actress and writer, married an American, came to America. And then she was involved because she fell out with her husband over his view on slavery. And she wrote about that. So Fanny Kemble's a very interesting figure. I did even consider writing a double biography of sort of Sarah and Fanny, but I eventually thought there was enough in Sarah. But Fanny is a fascinating story and relevant for America.
Definitely, it all is, because we can all see some aspect of the current times with everything you've said. I'm just like, okay, I'm, again, Kardashians, Nicole Kidman,
That's
whatever,
right.
with a couple minutes left, can you let us know what you're working on next?
Oh, I'm still trying to decide on a subject matter next. It's quite hard to come up with somebody else. I'd like to stay in the 18th century, and I'm looking currently at an artist, but also at a kind of entrepreneur and lace maker. So I will decide on one of those in time, but I'm trying not to push myself too much and
Yeah.
find the right subject to get involved with.
Well, as we said, this is your second career, so you can sort of take your time and do it right.
Well, I think it is. It's because once you start on that road, I find you get completely obsessed, and there's just so much to think about and do. And then it's having got so deep into the research, is then trying to make it accessible to people, because little nuggets that for me seem fascinating. Actually, if you're just coming into that world, you don't want to get bogged down with it too much. So it's trying to find clear storytelling in all of that heap of of words and of facts.
Right. I mean,
It
you
was a
probably
difficult
could have
thing.
written 5 books about Sarah with probably everything that you
That's the
gathered.
trouble. Once you start, yes, exactly. You have to prune away and think, no, you don't need that. You don't need that. Yes, to get the essence of what she is.
Well, I have to ask the librarian question is what would, doing the research, where did you find the most meat for Sarah? Like what libraries or historical places did you find the most information?
Well, she has lots of her work at the Bodleian and also in Bristol. Actually, the Folger Shakespeare Library has fantastic stuff. I didn't have to visit there because you can find that resource online now, which is fantastic. But actually, the archive in Bath I found the most useful, mainly because in there was Sarah's notebook that nobody had ever trawled before, her private notebook. And in that, I found lots of really helpful stuff, little things she'd copied down, and recipes and notes she'd made for herself, which I found fantastically useful. Really, really good. So yes, the Bath Archive was wonderful. There was something magical about having first research, that no one else has ever looked at. It's just the most incredible thing, rather than secondhand.
I'm feeling like a librarian type field trip needing to come on,
Yeah,
These
I think
places.
so. Bath is definitely worth visiting. Anybody who hasn't been to Bath, you must go. It's a beautiful city and it still has very much a feel of the 18th century about it. It really
I have
does.
heard. I'm gonna get there someday for sure.
Definitely get there, definitely.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for this talk. It's been enlightening, fascinating, and like visually stunning for my eyes. Like the art,
Oh,
like I said, it's just gorgeous. So
uh,
thank you
that's a
for
huge
being
pleasure. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Yeah, I'm just going to have a little look in the chat now.
I can send you the chat later. I don't think people were chatting that much, but also I want to thank everybody for being here and asking your questions and for celebrating this amazing person, Sarah Siddons, with us for today. And I hope you all go down your research rabbit holes for her.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're
Thank
welcome,
you.
Joe. Have a wonderful day. Have a great
Yes,
day, everybody.
bye-bye.